In the Black Swan, you have the turkey is, in my book, the Black Swan, turkey is fed for 1,000 days. Every single day confirms to the turkey that that butcher is extremely, or the human race in general, is extremely interested in its welfare, increasingly, until, of course, when the Black Swan happens. I'm interested in the story of the turkey, one, because it shows the Black Swan story, and the consequences of inferring from observables. But the other one is that for the turkey, it's a black swan. But for the butcher, it's not a black swan. Okay? So black swan depends on the set of knowledge you have. If I'm sending a package to southwestern Siberia, all right, and it has it's a wedding, and you're sending a wedding gift, so you have champagne flutes. What do you write on a package? Fragile, and underneath, to explain it to the Russian inspector, what do you say? Handle with care, all right? Okay. So what is the opposite of handle with care? If you're going to send the exact opposite package, what would you write on it? Yeah, exactly. Please mishandle. So something that is fragile, if you map it properly mathematically, you realize that the fragile is what does not like disorder. It doesn't want mishandling. It doesn't want volatility. It wants peace and predictability. So the opposite of that would be something that loves volatility. And it's in the Talmudic literature that there is a king who had to punish his son, and he had to crush him with a big stone. And given that he was both a king and a father, he had a dilemma till it was solved by a local counselor who told him it's very simple: crush the big stone in pebbles and then throw pebbles at him. That's the definition of fragility. Anything that survived, conditional on something having survived, it has to be harmed disproportionately. You see, the larger the stone, the more the harm. There's a story in both Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game of a fellow who lost $1 million trading green lumber. He knew everything about lumber, green lumber, everything. The economics, the mathematics, the statistics, collected data, everything. And lost $1 million, and wrote an account what I learned losing $1 million. And he reports that there's a fellow, a pit trader. It's like, I don't know if you met pit traders, but they look like pit traders, and they act like pit traders, right? And the fellow was making tons of money with green lumber and had been doing so consistently. Now, the narrator discovers that the fellow made a lot of money in green lumber, didn't know, he thought it was lumber painted green. He didn't know it was freshly cut lumber. Okay. So, is it that that person, this is a very Hayekian argument, knew nothing about it? No. That he knew a lot of stuff, but not necessarily what you think from the outside is valuable. So that when you have skin in the game, you tend to know a lot of stuff about the business, about things, all right, that you wouldn't guess you need to know from the outside. And this is very hard to explain. And this is why machine learning is successful, because machine learning has no ideas. It learns from the inside, not from the outside. It's a choice between two doctors. One doctor who looks like the Hollywood version of a doctor, of a surgeon, well-mannered, well-educated, and then the other person looks like a butcher. And these two have the same track record, have the same rank at the hospital. Okay? Which doctor would you pick? Yeah. Sorry? The one, because this person had to overcome, because it's not judged at all by anything external, nothing peer-reviewed, judged entirely by the track record, you see, by the performance. You have to overcome all this perception bias to get there. So this is it. When a field that has skin in the game, the cosmetic, beware of the cosmetic. Likewise, you want to fund people? If they know how to write business plans, no. Okay? If they make money at something and you don't understand how, hire them. Right? It's a green lumber problem. Hammurabi's rule. And it says the following. If the architect builds a building and the building collapses and kills the owner of the building, what should happen to the architect? He should be put to death. I mean, it was Babylon 3,800 years ago, so they were not, didn't have a very sophisticated legal code, all right? And then, of course, if it kills the firstborn son of the architect is put to death. So they're looking for symmetry. Now, what was the idea of Hammurabi's code? It was not eye for eye. Eye for eye, limiting damages, and making things balanced. No. It was that you cannot walk away from risks you've created for others. You should own your risks. That's the idea of Hammurabi's code. You cannot have civilized society unless those who create risks aren't also bearers of risk. So there is a severe error in reasoning, and that you often hear by people giving you empirical data and telling you, for example, that we're idiots to worry about Ebola that killed 2 Americans when more people slept with Kim Kardashian that year. So for example, and that was effectively the number they said, that more people slept with Kim Kardashian in 2014 when we were worried about Ebola than died of Ebola, for example, right? So, and then sometimes you see numbers like these, and this is the kind of thing that if you read something called the New York Times, and you still read that nonsense, this kind of stuff you read in it, which is factually right, but bogus, okay? Well, and the kind of thing that teach in psychology department, that so many Americans die from eating too many hamburgers, smoking too much alcohol. Now let's think about it in terms of tails. If I tell you, or let's say Steven Pinker gave the number that 3,000 Americans die in their bathtub every year. Okay, 3,000 people, whereas 2 have died of Ebola. Now let's play a thought experiment. If you read in the papers, if you go, to Mars and come back, and then read on, on Google News that 2 billion people have died, what's more likely to have killed them? Diabetes, obesity, falling in their bathtub, sleeping with Kim Kardashian, or Ebola? Ebola. Okay, there we go. So you cannot compare. Rule number 1, thou shalt not compare a multiplicative, fat-tailed process in extremistan in the sub-exponential class to a thin-tailed process that has what we call Chernoff bounds, okay? And that is totally from mediocre stan, simply because of the catastrophe principle, okay? And then we know, for example, that it's very cheap to protect yourself from Ebola. You see, the probability that people dying from smoking, okay, is multiplied by 10 next year is 1 to the 10 minus 30. The probability that the rate of people who died from Ebola triples is vastly higher, you see? So you cannot compare processes. Thin tails to fat tails are not comparable. So this is not empiricism. This is called naive empiricism. It's actually worse, okay? So you cannot compare 2 processes like these by saying we worry too much about Ebola. In fact, we worry too much about diabetes and too little about Ebola. My parents had in their collection a book by Plautus, comedies by Plautus, that my father bought for something like $5 in Moscow and whatever, when he was visiting 50 years ago. Anyway, the book was 500 years old. It looked no different from a regular book. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have encountered the floppy disk drive. Okay, all right. So I have stuff written on floppy disk drive not long ago, 10 years ago. Can't retrieve it, can't read them. I'm glad I can't read them because I'm sure I'd be very disappointed by the literary quality of what I wrote 10 years ago. But so you understand the difference between the 2 worlds. One seemingly is not efficient. A book is heavy. It's so passé, all right? The other is hip. It's technology. And guess what? So the problem with technology is that it seemingly optimizes things, but it does cause some fragility. And my idea is anything that becomes complex becomes a lot more fragile to black swans, to these events named, Black Swan after some exception mentioned by Juvenal. And my black swan is different because I'm not talking about birds, I'm talking about events with some characteristics. So that idea came to me before, I finished the Black Swan. I don't know how many of you remember or were old enough to remember the 2003 problem we had in New York City when we had a blackout. You remember the blackout? Okay, I don't know if you've seen pictures of Grand Central, but I don't go to the movies anymore for reasons. And I watched, I remember, it reminds me of a scene of a train station in Dr. Zhivago, people sleeping on the floor. You don't know if they're dead, you walk over bodies, in Grand Central, New York. That was 2003. 2003. Grand Central, 2003. New York City, so vulnerable to a technological glitch and became an obsession for me. And I remember, I couldn't wash my hands because they had that fancy technology, no more faucets. It's so much passé, and it works beautifully. You wave in front of it. Sometimes it doesn't work, of course, but here you couldn't wash your hands. You couldn't get water because they were 100% reliant on technology. So I understood what notion of fragility was, and I knew that the idea of Black Swan had to be coupled with what systems are more fragile to Black Swan than others. So I continued my idea with that stub, and I'm continuing now.